Okay, so we'll be doing things, of course, a little differently from the rest of the lecture series that we've had this semester, because we have three presenters. So they will all present in turn, and then for the question and answer period, because we have the three presenters, we will actually have the three presenters, two of them here, one in the back, and we will just invite you to go directly to the presenter that you want to address with a question, and we'll have a more informal, sort of personal one-on-one Q&A session at the end of our time today. So I will introduce our first speaker, and we'll begin. Our first speaker is Alexander Keogh, who is from Bentonville, Arkansas. He's a senior studying psychology and Chinese with a concurrent master's in Chinese professional language. Served a mission in Taiwan, Taipei, loves traveling to new places and learning languages. He is the co-founder of the Peacemaker Project on BYU campus, which focuses on building understanding and dignity across ideological gaps. He's passionate about finding creative cross-cultural solutions to tough problems and plans to pursue a PhD in cross-cultural negotiation and conflict management. He'll be speaking to us today about, quote, a city in transition, exploring Hong Kong's identity in the new millennium. So please join me in welcoming Alex.
Thank you. I'm super excited to present my research from this semester on a topic that is really important to me. I'll be talking about the identity of Hong Kongers during the 21st century. Now, first, before I kind of jump into the interviews that we did with several people who have observed transitions in Hong Kong firsthand, I want to thank all of the people who participated in their courage in sharing their stories, regardless of what their political opinions were or their observations on what has happened in Hong Kong. Thank you for participating, and that's what makes this research possible. Okay, so for this research, we interviewed a bunch of people who are from Hong Kong and observed social movements that have persisted in the form of pro-democracy movements over the past decade in Hong Kong. Before we talk about what people had to say and the different themes that we found coming out of our interviews, let's just go over a quick background about Hong Kong as a place. As you know, Hong Kong was under British rule, and that was from 1841 to 1997. Now, the British and the Chinese struck a deal that in 1997, Hong Kong would return to being technically part of China, but under a one country, two systems model, which basically meant that the government would be in, the PRC government, the People's Republic of China, would be in Beijing, but Hong Kong would have its own form of government, and that some of the more democratic values that were enshrined in Hong Kong law at that time would persist for at least 50 years. So they were guaranteed a, quote, high degree of autonomy for the next 50 years, from 1997, theoretically, until 2047. Now, this is an important legacy of colonialism because as Hong Kong, as a colony of Great Britain, is greatly influenced by Western culture and politics and power dynamics. And interestingly, as Hong Kong moves out of the colonial period under British rule, it now finds itself facing what some more provocative scholarly commentators might call neo-colonialist power, with China and the People's Republic of China having increased degree of rule inside of Hong Kong and on Hong Kong politics. In 1997, when Hong Kong goes back over to China, people on the ground in Hong Kong didn't feel much of a difference in their lives for a few years. One of the first ripples was in 2007 when Beijing scheduled that in 2017 they would hold the first democratic election of a chief executive in Hong Kong. so there was this expectation that in 2017 there would be universal suffrage in Hong Kong. Now in 2014, the PRC government announced that they would basically be handpicking a select number of potential officials that Hong Kongers could select during this upcoming election, which sparked the 2014 Umbrella Movement, which is a pro-democracy movement and 79-day occupation of Hong Kong streets, where people demanded expanded democratic freedoms and to be able to choose who they wanted to become chief executive and occupy other positions in the Hong Kong government. Now, no concessions were made by the Chinese government, so practically speaking, it's hard to tell the tangible benefit in policy that came from the 2014 Umbrella Movement. But it did establish important social networks of pro-democracy activists that again mobilized in 2019 when Beijing was pushing through a bill that would allow the Chinese government to extradite Hong Kong citizens to the mainland to receive judgment for various crimes by Chinese law. And these protests lasted 7 months, and at its peak, it saw 2 million people on the streets at once protesting the passage of this law. So you can see this is just an absolutely enormous amount of people covering the streets. And their purpose in these protests first was demanding the withdrawal of an extradition bill that would allow China to extradite Hong Kong citizens to the mainland for judgment. But also it kind of became a statement of dissatisfaction with how the police had been dealing with protests, whether it was in 2014 with the Umbrella Movement or in 2019 while protesting this extradition bill. And it also blossomed into a broader pro-democracy movement, which more people were supportive of. Now, what does Hong Kong look like now? Well, just this year, Article 23 was passed, which was a controversial piece of legislation that allowed the Chinese government and the government in Hong Kong to prosecute Hong Kong citizens for engaging in acts that were deemed as treason or sedition or collaborating with foreign entities. Now, this could be things as simple as pro-democracy advocacy in conjunction with groups outside of Hong Kong. So critics say that this was introduced a sweeping legislation that would allow Beijing to prosecute pro-democracy advocates. And there's also the Hong Kong 47 was a controversy that just last month, 45 of the Hong Kong 47 who were deemed by the Chinese government as kind of instigators of the 2019 protests and other pro-democracy movements. 45 of them were sentenced from somewhere between 4 to 10 years in prison just last month. And so liberties in Hong Kong, according to these pro-democracy advocates, are decreasing as the years go by, despite the protests in 2014 and 2019. Now, importantly, in 2020 polling reveals that actually less than half of the public is willing to say that they're supportive of the pro-democracy protest movement, which probably reflects some of the reaction that the average Hong Konger has to the crackdown from both the Hong Kong government and the government in Beijing. Okay, so what was the impetus for this research? Well, we wanted to understand how Hong Kongers identify with their city throughout these political transitions. We also wanted to understand how they react to these developments and how they view the results that have come from protests. And then also, we wanted to evaluate how effective were the persuasion tactics implemented by pro-democracy movements according to those who either participated in the movements, of which some of our participants have, or observed the movements. So we use an inductive research design, which basically means that we didn't go into this research with any specific hypothesis about what Hong Kongers would feel about the democracy movements or what they would have to say, but rather we found the themes as we interviewed people, and we used a semi-structured interview protocol to change the interview protocol from interview to interview as we found salient themes across the different people we were talking to. And all of our, most of our participants were Hong Kong citizens that are either living abroad. Most of them are living abroad. So here are some emerging themes, which is kind of the foundation for the research that I'm presenting today. So there are political schisms among the Hong Kongers that we interviewed. Some describe the protests as extreme measures, indicating that they might, their reaction to some of Beijing's crackdowns, and that perhaps these protests provoked some restrictions of civil liberties that wouldn't have happened absent protests. But those who participate in the social movements describe these actions as the only thing that they could really do, and that they had this moral responsibility to let the government know this is how we feel. They also cite that in Hong Kong law, according to their understanding at the time, it protected their right to assembly, so they didn't anticipate such heavy crackdowns on the protest. Another theme is Hong Kong identity being strengthened, whether people participate in the protests or not. All the interviews and all the people that we interviewed express a strengthening of their connection and identification with Hong Kong as a city. One quote is from someone who actually didn't necessarily show enthusiastic support for the protest movement, said that I would want my children to know, even if they were living abroad, that they have Hong Kong blood in their veins, making a distinction between Chinese blood. And I'd want them to know that a person's identity can be multifaceted. In other words, you might be living abroad, but you'll always be a Hong Konger, even if the certain PRC policies begin to water down Hong Kong culture within Hong Kong, through things like changing education curriculum and having children speak Mandarin in schools rather than Cantonese. And this quote to me was very powerful. Someone said in our interviews that we are not one, speaking of Hong Kongers with Chinese people, but we are very close, speaking culturally. But belief is what makes us separate. I love Chinese culture. I love the Mandarin language. I just don't want the government to take away fundamental rights. So according to a lot of these people who participated in the social movement, the schism between what made somebody Hong Konger and someone who was on the PRC mainland was their belief rather than their culture as broader Chinese cultural sphere. Now, there was a generally pessimistic tone on the practical outcome of protests, which is interesting. So even the people who participated in the protest acknowledged the tangible outcomes were really hard to find from these protests. In fact, some people drew a causal link for restricted civil liberties with the protests, meaning that perhaps by engaging in these protests, some of the reactions from the Hong Kong government in Beijing were provoked. But when describing the motivation for protesting among the people who participated, one commentator said, I had to do this for my city. We were afraid Hong Kong wouldn't be Hong Kong anymore, and I don't think it is. So this both captures the pessimism about the tangible outcomes from the Hong Kong pro-democracy social movements, but also the feeling among people that they didn't have another avenue for expressing their political concerns and opinions with restricting civil liberties in Hong Kong. Some pragmatists describe the protests as counterproductive, but again, the protesters, even if they acknowledged that there was little tangible gains from the protest, no one expressed any second guessing or regret for participating in protests, which is really important because it underlines the belief that they had that their right to assembly would be protected and that they had a moral responsibility to do something. Their grievances were not being addressed through political channels and through elected officials, so they felt we have to stand up and say something, even if it triggers perhaps a negative response. Not trying something is worse than trying something and provoking a response. So proponents of negotiation in political channels, there were some of these people who were more critical of the social movements, and they maintained that through more traditional channels they could maintain their existing freedoms while not provoking more draconian response from Hong Kong or Beijing government. But by finding overlapping interests, they could negotiate ways to preserve the freedoms that they already had. Now, historians sometimes call this Monday morning quarterbacking, going back in time and thinking, okay, now we know what happened because of the social movements, or maybe not, it's hard to draw a causal link, but we know what happened after the social movements, and so should they have been started or not? And I'd say this is a kind of tough position to take, criticizing protesters from hindsight, because as protesters and people who participated in the movement stated, they thought that their civil liberties would be protected, and they emphasized their moral responsibility to do something. Now, future outlook of Hong Kong identity acknowledges that there are inevitable transitions on the horizon, with People's Republic of China aiming to water down Hong Kong culture in schools, with things like changing curriculum, but there's a determination to preserve Hong Kong's distinct identity, including moving families abroad, and it might create this interesting phenomenon where 50 years from now, the most Hong Kongers are Hong Kongers living abroad rather than living in Hong Kong. Now, the key summary, and this is the final thing I want to leave everyone with, is that while tangible gains might have remained elusive from these social movements by talking to the people who participated and the Hong Kongers who observed on the ground. Identity with Hong Kong was strengthened, and protesters stressed that they needed to act somehow. This kind of raises a question about how do we evaluate protests? Should we weigh the practical outcomes with priority, or should we weigh the responsibility that people have to take a stand for what they believe in? Now, the protesters, inevitably, everyone that we interviewed preferred the latter interpretation, that we should judge the success of a social movement based on, or the necessity for a social movement based on some moral responsibility rather than, in hindsight, what practical implications the movement had. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for spending some time with me. And again, we just want to thank everyone who was courageous enough to share their stories with us. And I hope that we can better understand what people are going through in Hong Kong now and how to evaluate social movements. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alex, for that really interesting presentation. Our next presenter is Annie Walker, who is studying editing and publishing and sociology with minors in history and communications. She's from Orange County, California, loves music, composition, and writing. She's heavily involved on campus, and she's one of the vice presidents of BYUSA, where she oversees the Student Advisory Council. This is her second year at BYU, and she plans to go into appellate law after graduation in 2027. She will be speaking to us on Words of Conquest, American Imperial Linguistics in the Philippines. So please join me in welcoming Annie.
Hello, everyone. I just want to take a minute and thank you all for making the time to be here today. I know it's very busy with finals and everything going on, so it really means a lot. So I am presenting on American imperialist linguistics in the Philippines. If you didn't get it from the bio, I love words, I love history, and I love people. So this kind of encapsulates all of that. Linguistically, the Philippines has always fascinated me, not only because of the hundreds of languages that are spoken there, but because they have been colonized 3 separate times by Spain, America, and Japan, all 3 of which having different colonial imperialistic policies. So, history lesson time. After acquiring the Philippines in 1898, the United States quickly established a public education system, which was recognized by Act No. 74 in 1901. The American colonizers had a very interesting mindset during this time. They acquired the Philippines from Spain and saw how Spain had treated them. In contrast, Americans deemed themselves to be benevolent, and so they promoted assimilation policies, which included Protestant missionaries, American English teachers, and Filipino teachers trained in American methods. So society became such that English was not just a mark of literacy, but a stepping stone to better jobs, social prestige, and alignment with American cultural values. So English was not just a classroom subject. It was a tool of governance. Government documents, legal texts, and administrative records were all produced in English. Much of the foundation of the Filipino country exists in English. For the first time, the Philippines saw a systematic language policy put into place, one designed to elevate English while sidelining other languages. English fluency meant better economic opportunities and higher status. It was the language of social mobility. Many young Filipinos studied English to become teachers, clerks, and civil servants, joining a new English-speaking elite. The colonial government even sponsored some students to study in the United States, ensuring that English-educated Filipinos would return to bolster the colonial administration's interests. I think that it is very important to establish this concept of benevolent assimilation before getting into the brunt of my research. President McKinley issued the Benevolent Assimilation Proclamation, stating that the Philippines was incapable of self-governance and that there is a need for Americans to be present. And in response to this, the Philippines actually declared a republic. However, this was not recognized by the United States, and they remained under colonization. Linguists Sabayan and Gonzalez give us 2 clear stages in the history of English linguistics in the Philippines. First, we have Imperial English, which was during the time that English colonized the Philippines, which made English a tool to civilize Filipinos. It was not a neutral thing. Then came post-Imperial English, when the Philippines gained independence. However, even though the Americans left, English did not. It stayed, it grew, and became a part of Filipino society and nation building. So, to understand how English has developed, we can turn to Edgar Schneider's dynamic model of post-colonial Englishes. He outlines 5 stages, as seen on the screen, of how English evolves in former colonies. These are foundation, exonormative stabilization, nativization, endonormative stabilization, and differentiation. I would love to get very in-depth with all of these, however, I want to talk about endonormative stabilization. This is where the Philippines currently exists and resides today, linguistically. So, English is no longer a foreign import in the Philippines. It has its own rules, expressions, and cultural flavor. Poet Jamino Abad beautifully represents this stage when he says, "English is now ours, we have colonized it too." English, once the language of the colonizer, has been reclaimed and reshaped by Filipinos. With the American English language and culture imposed on them, and no sign of independence for decades to come, a question arose. If Filipinos could take ownership of a language imposed by colonial rule, could they also forge a national language that represents their own identity? How could they find a space in a linguistic environment where space has been taken from them? Decades before independence, Filipino leaders asked themselves this question. There's plenty of research on the Philippines, especially regarding English linguistics. However, I noticed that there was a void that needed to be filled. The politics of national languages themselves are much less discussed. Even as US colonial administrators tightened their grip through language, Filipinos were never passive recipients of this cultural overhaul. They had their own internal debates, their own attempts to reclaim voice and authority. However, this was no simple task. The Philippines, after all, is a nation of more than 100 languages. Along with English, Americans imposed something else, nationalism. So, Filipinos then wrestled with forming a national identity. And with this, the formation of a national language. Each linguistic shift, they renamed Tagalog to Filipino, and each one of these shifts represented a strategy for building a unified identity. In the 1930s, the Filipino self-rule was on the horizon, and leaders decided that Tagalog, spoken in and around Manila, was the natural choice for a national language. But in elevating one local language above the others, Tagalog came to symbolize not only the national unity, but internal power struggles. Non-Tagalog speakers feared the substitution of one linguistic dominance, English, for another, which was homegrown but still unevenly distributed. The ghost of American Imperial Linguistics haunted this process. The desire to forge a national language strong enough to counter English made the push for Tagalog more urgent, but also more fraught. In 1959, Tagalog was renamed to Filipino to soften these ethnic biases and present the national language as inclusive to all Filipinos. Filipino emerged as a banner of anti-colonial sentiment. Yet, by rallying around and against the English, Filipino also established its own hierarchy. So finally, they shifted Filipino to Filipino. This move carried with it the utopian promise of a language that would represent every Filipino tongue. Filipino was imagined as a linguistic unity born of all of the islands, neutralizing old resentments while standing against the still potent legacy of English dominance. The letter F symbolized something new, something that hadn't been done before. It was modern and less anchored to the perceived pluralities of P. But in reality, 50 years later, Tagalog was not what it promised. Or Filipino, excuse me. It ended up just being a standardized Tagalog, reinforcing old patterns of dominance, even as it gestured towards inclusivity. American linguistic imperialism had set in motion a profound insecurity about identity and belonging, an insecurity now projected onto the national language itself. When I first began this talk, I brought up my love for language. It is a tool to uncover the roots of history. And so the issue of language in any capacity is not just a medium of instruction or nationalism, but one of nation building and nation destroying. P&F in the Philippines was politics of linguistic resistance and dominance. But what is clear is that having this national language represents the fight for political independence against American neocolonial rule. The nation-building project in the Philippines has been described extensively as an unfinished revolution. Indeed, this is true based on the lens of linguistics. Filipinos fought American rule, but the hegemonic visions of a collective national struggle and identity have likewise exposed the country to its national struggles over power and control. National language policies are deeply entwined with the difficulty of building the nation itself. But it is precisely through the cracks of nation building that the promise of emancipation of all forms of hegemony may be achieved. Linguistically, this means confronting the enduring influence of American colonialism, which promoted English as a superior and unifying force while marginalizing indigenous languages. The assumption that English, or even the national language, must be the sole medium of instruction reflects a colonial hangover that reinforces hierarchies of power. Rather than clinging to the singular linguistic model of English, there must be a more inclusive approach to nation building through linguistics, one that recognizes the coexistence and equal value of all Filipino languages. This does not mean abandoning the national language or languages of Filipino and English, because it now functions as a national lingua franca, nor does it negate the importance of English as a global tool. Instead, it challenges the dominance of colonial languages and seeks to democratize linguistic policy. The point, rather, is that nation building should be inclusive and democratic, an alternative political project that does not crush the multiplicity reality of the country. In recent years, policies like mother tongue-based multilingual education have begun to address these tensions. By reintroducing local languages into classrooms, educators and policymakers acknowledge that nation building doesn't have to mean sacrificing linguistic diversity. There is a growing awareness that true independence, culturally, intelligently, and socially, does not hinge on adopting English or a single Filipino language. Rather, it can be found in acknowledging the many tongues, each carrying its own truths and histories. With that comes acknowledging the power that American English has played and continues to play in Filipino linguistics. English is still one of the two national languages of the Philippines. It continues to be used in government, religion, and economic matters. It remains entrenched as a language of power. This enduring legacy reminds us that language is never neutral. It carries with it the weight of history, the assertion of dominance, and the struggle for self-determination. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annie. Again, all right, our final speaker is Tala Alnasser, who is an Arab Muslim student from Jordan and Palestine. She is double majoring in public relations and French with a minor in sociology. She currently serves as the executive vice president of BYU student body. In her free time, she enjoys playing chess, cooking with her friends, and traveling to engage in cross-cultural or interfaith experiences. After graduation, Tala hopes to get a joint JD and Master of Divinity from Harvard, continuing her research on the intersectionality of law and religion. She became interested in this topic after a study abroad in France during her freshman year, where she learned about the French practice of la laïcité and the way it disproportionately discriminates against Muslim women in France. So she will be speaking to us about evangelizing Sharia, French colonial influence in Tunisian religious law. So please join me in welcoming Tala.
Okay. Whoa, I gotta put it down. I'm not as tall. Okay, I'm really excited to be here. I should have left this topic probably as a PhD thesis, but it's okay. We're gonna give it a shot as an undergrad anyway. So thanks for being here, guys. The French legacy of colonialism has altered its colonial subjects of their understanding of who they are and who their community ought to be. For Tunisia, which was a French colony, the legacy of French colonialism can be seen in how it has evangelized its largely Muslim population's understanding of Sharia law as it governs interreligious relations. This evangelization is characterized by what I call the Christian gaze, which I hope to write about in my honors thesis, hopefully next year. So the Christian gaze is the invisible hand of Christianity that assumes the default Christian viewer. In this paper, more specifically, it assumes the European Christian society as the norm, and other societies as deviations away from it. In other words, it uses the political systems and ideologies that emerged from and in an attempt to resolve years of Christian European conflict as the persisting lens through which people see the world unbeknown to them. In terms of religion in Europe, the emergence of the Christian gaze came from reshifting the position of religion in society from being primary and overt to secondary and covert. And so because of that, we saw the rise of the idea of the nation state, which formalized borders according to shared ethnic, linguistic, or cultural ties, and the transformation from religious tolerance to religious freedom, which, if you guys don't know, is characterized by policies of non-interference and neutrality, where the state kind of is separate from religion. This, however, is drastically different from Sharia law. Sharia law is the divine law of God that governs Muslim life. And in the Ottoman Empire, which ruled from the late 1200s to the early 1900s, Sharia was marked by the unification of law and spirit, where it not only informed the actions of everyday life for Muslims, but it also provided a social and political order. So religion in Ottoman society was an active agent. And it was used as the primary marker of identity and the guiding framework for which all spheres of life in Ottoman society was built on in terms of the political, the social, etc. And interreligious laws were no exception. The Ottoman Empire used what was called the millet system, which provided a degree of autonomy to non-Muslim communities by getting representatives of different communities appointed by the qadi, or the judge. The judge would appoint a representative, which the local religious populations would elect, and that spokesperson, or mutakallim, would be used to kind of help with certain administrative works. So here we can see how religious affiliation, as opposed to language or ethnicity, determined one's social standing. And this kind of shows the contrast between the model that the Ottomans use compared to the Europeans in terms of integrating religion into society. However, the Christian gaze made its way into the Islamic world through two primary ways. First, self-imposingly, and second, and rather more forcefully, through colonialism. And for this presentation, I'll focus on the latter. However, because the former kind of allowed the latter, I'll give a brief history. So the Ottoman Empire self-imposingly internalized the Christian gaze when it began to adopt modern ideas during a time period called the Tanzimat, or ordering in Arabic. And that was around like the 1700s. So during this time, we saw the rise in nationalism and the creation of centralized governments that were marginally governed by religion. And so religion went from being the center of society to kind of being pushed into the peripheries. And in the now province of Tunis, which later became known as Tunisia, which was notoriously known for its ilm, which is Arabic for Islamic-based education. The centralized local government presided over individuals that shared linguistic, culture, and ethnic ties. And in doing so, it systematically devalorized the ulama, which were the scholars of Islam, from being educators, teachers, and political advisors in the public spheres to becoming solely teachers in the more privatized spheres like schools. Now, these, of course, are fragments of the Christian gaze, and it wasn't until after the French invasion of Tunis in 1881 that turned it into a French protectorate that we really start to see the Christian gaze proliferate in the Muslim psyche. French colonialism often used schools as a primary medium for intellectual colonization. They would use it as a mode to transmit French ideals and values. And so the ulama, for example, would continue to teach Arabic, arithmetics, and Quran, which is like the Muslim book, right, in schools until primary. And then following that, students would start to get instruction in French. And this would include lessons on French Republican values, including the French idea of separation of church and state, la laïcité. La laïcité traces its framework back to the law of 1905 that separates, La laïcité traces its framework back to the law of 1905 that states that the Republic does not recognize, salute, or subsidize any religion. And that in turn inspired the first article of the French Constitution, that declares France as a laïque state, or a secular state. La laïcité implies the neutrality of the state and guarantees the freedom of conscience and the freedom to manifest one's belief or convictions within the limits of respect for public order. Put simply, religion became a private affair practiced within the confines of your own private space. This is especially relevant as though Tunisia gained its independence in 1956, much of their current laws mirror that of French civil law. La laïcité, more specifically, became the foundational principle and guiding framework for the current Tunisian law on interreligious affairs. And the law reads as follows. The state is the guardian of religion. It guarantees freedom of conscience and the belief, the exercise of religious practices, and the neutrality of mosques as places of worship from all partisan instrumentalization. Here we can see the legacy of European Christianity and colonialism embroider the words of a seemingly Islamic state. Though being the guardian of religion, of course being Islam, the Tunisian government's policy of religious non-interference is consistent with the French concept of separation of church and state. The phrase freedom of conscience and belief implies an abrogation of some former guarding power that shackled this liberty and granted it to some and not others. Except the phantom of this guarding power in this case is the Catholic Church, which, in the context of Tunisia, had no formal authority or history of conflict in the region. Thus, phrasing it as a freedom begs the question of freedom from who? Furthermore, the phrase neutrality of the mosque shows a paradoxical understanding of the purpose of a mosque. Whereas Islamically and historically it was seen as a place for spiritual, political, educational, and social discussion and instruction, its newly imposed neutrality suggests a history where it was used for negative partisan instrumentalization. And in doing so, it implicitly neglects the role mosques have historically played in advancing knowledge and accessibility of it in Muslim civilization and replaces it with a negatively connotated legacy. Analyzing these phrases, we can see how employing them in the Tunisian constitution isn't necessarily indicative of Tunisians' embracing of modern ideas so much as Tunisians mistakenly embracing France's history with religion as its own. Contrasting the inherent nature of religion in Muslim society that acted as the primary marker of identity, here we can see how evangelizing Sharia meant turning it into a passive agent, one that's kind of hidden beneath the ornated rugs of a civilization that was marked with grandiosity and strength, and yet dusted by a harsher reality of imperial rule that virtually made the memory of an Islamic ummah or an Islamic civilization faint in its conception and elusive in its pursuit. And though France does not overtly concern itself with the decimation of the sacred, the legacy of what functioned to mitigate Christian denominational differences in practice in the Muslim world existed as such. So the tragedy of the Christian gaze in a post-colonial world comes in imposing its systems on communities that do not befit it. And though this is one example of the Christian gaze, it is important to note that it permeates all aspects of a post-colonial world. Though researchers, I think, have done a great job in uncovering remnants of colonialism as they pertain to race and ethnicity with the white gaze or gender with the male gaze, they have yet to unpack the implications religion, and more specifically European Christianity, has had on the colonial subject and his society. And in doing so, we may better see the gap of trying to reconcile adopting modern ways of governance that are informed by a European Christian history in a society that does not need it, and thus perhaps work to deconstruct those systems, not to go back to traditional ways, but to focus on a way forward that is authentic to the community's needs and actual history.